So for example, schools, churches, and universities do not pay any property taxes whatsoever, not a cent. And yet many of these exempt institutions are very big landowners that are using a ton of treated culinary water outside to water grass landscapes. The University of Utah is a great example of this. They use 10 to 15% of all of the water in Salt Lake City on an annual basis, and they don't pay 1 cent of property taxes. So the water rates that the University of Utah receives from Salt Lake City are lowered effectively by all the tax payments of its taxpayers. And that's a silly thing, especially for a fiscally conservative state that pretends to be Republican, to do. We need to embrace some of the basic free market around making users pay for the water they use. In the 20th century, there was 15.2 million acre-feet of water in the Colorado River Basin, according to that century's average in the Bureau of Reclamation sources. In the 21st century, what we've seen about the last 20 years is that there's been about a 20% drop in those flows because of aridification, because climate change is shrinking our snowpacks in the headwater mountains where the Colorado River water comes from. The headwater mountains of Colorado, Wyoming, and Utah account for only about 1/8 of the landmass, and yet they provide 7/8 of the water to the Colorado because snow is our future. It is where our water supply comes from. Snow is our biggest reservoir, and climate change is shrinking that reservoir because we're reducing the total amount of winter. It starts later in the year and it ends earlier in the spring, and we are shrinking the amount of snowpack because we are heating up the lower portions of those watersheds. And so there's just less snow to melt and go into our rivers and our reservoirs. And so this aridification problem is the biggest problem facing the water supply of the Colorado River system. And for the last 20 years, largely, water suppliers in the 7 western states and the federal government have largely ignored climate change. And because of that, we have not reduced our spending. We have not reduced our water depletions and our diversions from the system. And so that means the only give in the system was shrinking these reservoirs down. And that's really why our reservoirs have shrunk. We released a report in December in which we showed, based on the available literature and the science that was out there, that the upper basin is using more water than it is entitled to out of the leftovers that are in this pie. And it's a major problem because, the upper basin likes to point fingers at the lower basin and say they're using too much water. But the upper basin is using too much water. Utah is using 500,000 acre-feet more water than it is entitled to under the law of the river, under all the agreements of the compact and the subsequent 48 compact and the 44 treaty with Mexico. I mean, it's quite clear that the upper basin is using too much water. And we're not even talking about tribal water, which many of those rights are not perfected. They're senior rights, but they haven't been perfected with the... Yeah,
they're not wet yet.
Yeah. So this idea that Utah hasn't used its full share of water is total farce. I mean, the numbers don't bear that out. In fact, Utah and Colorado and New Mexico are overusing water. And the only reason it hasn't been a bigger problem is because we've been draining the reservoirs to satisfy our lower basin delivery obligation. So when you look at the Colorado River Basin, in fact, America's largest reservoirs are there. Lake Mead is America's largest reservoir, and Lake Powell is the second largest reservoir in the United States. And the Bureau is in this untenable situation of having to choose between which of its children it wants to sacrifice. Glen Canyon Dam is a power generator that creates a lot of hydropower in the system, but it's not really that essential to the water supply. It's really only built to credit the upper basin to lower basin water deliveries, whereas the lower basin's Lake Mead Reservoir is critical to the water supply in 3 states. It's where they're storing and taking their water out every year. So it's generally regarded that Lake Mead will be the last to disappear in a climate change world. But it puts the Bureau in this untenable situation of having to sacrifice one of its projects. The challenge of the Colorado River Basin and its meth is really much like a diner on a Friday night and that last piece of pie. So the way the compact architecture works is that The lower basin gets 7.5 million acre feet. They get the first 7.5 million acre feet of water in the system. So it's like the cook in the back of the diner is making a pie. And the lower basin diners, they get exactly 7.5 million acre feet of that pie. And then the upper basin gets the leftovers. They get whatever is left over. So that's fine when the chef is baking a pie with 15 million acre feet in it. Then there's plenty of slices of pie to go around, okay? The problem is, all of a sudden, in the last couple decades, Mother Nature baked us a smaller pie, and there's no longer a pie of 15 million acre feet. Now the compact architecture is no longer equitable because the lower basin still gets its 7.5 million, but the amount of leftover, because the pie tin is smaller by Mother Nature, is much less for the upper basin. Are using treated culinary water, especially that is coming out of the hide of our Fish and Wildlife legacy, to irrigate grass is a highly questionable use of water. So I think we need to be careful about being hypocrites living in cities and saying it's those farmers' fault for using so much water on alfalfa. We also need to look at the equity of how we use water. Nevada only gets 300,000 acre feet of water out of the system of the Colorado River, and yet they have the same population of Utah, a state which has 3 times the water use out of the Colorado River. So if we're going to talk about equity, we can't just divide it around this arbitrary upper basin, lower basin bias. It's got to be about different populations and how they use water. So what we see in water is that when decisions are opened up to a broad community and we can have some dissent and some healthy, respectful debate, we make better policy. We released a report in December in which we showed, based on the available literature and the science that was out there, that the upper basin is using more water than it is entitled to out of the leftovers that are in this pie. And it's a major problem because, you know, the upper basin likes to point fingers at the lower basin and say they're using too much water. But the upper basin is using too much water. Utah is using 500,000 acre feet more water than it is entitled to under the law of the river.